What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel and another Outriders video. I've been messing around with Impale on the Devastator for the last couple of days, and I really think that the new mods that came with Worldslayer basically make this skill pretty damn sweet right now, and I kind of see it working in two different setups. I think on the one side, and the build that we're going to look at today capitalizes on the SEISMIC commander set and its additional damage to bleed, and then you complement Impale with skills like Earthquake and ways for you to ramp up your AP and then essentially getting more damage out of that. The other build, the second way, is of course with the Bannerlord, and in that way you can drive down the cooldown of Impale to extremely low levels with something like Tremor, and that then allows you to use more Impales. So as mentioned, today we're going to look at the SEISMIC commander variant of this, leveraging off the additional damage to bleed that comes from that set. As seems to be the norm for me at the moment right now, we do find a lot of builds that are exceptionally good at dealing with large crowds of enemy, doing crowd control, buffing up your allies, and essentially debuffing enemies, and this build is no slouch in that regard. As you can see with the footage in the background, this can easily lock down large groups of enemies due to the sheer amount of stuff that you can hit with your impales. You have access to a whole bunch of impales, 4 of them in actual fact, and also 3 quakes, so you can really just lay out a lot of damage, anomaly damage, and essentially make a whole bunch of stuff bleed. Now, where we have to increase the profile of this build and make it better at is essentially dealing damage to bosses. And the best way we can do that is to use reflex bullets as a ramp up effect that gives us more AP, as well as something like Fortress and Mage's Rage to give us even more additional AP, so we can make sure that those impales and those earthquakes hit as hard as possible. Now, this does not kill bosses at the same speed that you would get from something like Bleed Quake or a dedicated build that's focused around, using something like Leap and Despair to debuff the enemy before dumping a lot of damage onto it. But I definitely think this build makes up for that with the fact that you can so easily move around the battlefield and you can control the enemy so well, and you actually offer up some survivability and utility to the people that are playing with you. My suspicion is that the Bannerlord version of this would maybe be better at actually pushing out more damage on bosses, due to the simple fact that you'd be able to get access to more impales more regularly, and they really are able to chunk out quite a bit of damage, especially if you get the right configuration of mods on them. That being said, I do like goofing around with this quite a bit, and to me this is a alternate version to what you would have with Bleed Quake, where you have to kind of like really make sure that you are putting your quakes down in the right areas of the battlefield to maximize on the amount of damage that comes from that. The mods that we have on this build here allow you to essentially do your impales from all the way at the back and almost in a way play a support devastator in a way, since you can't really jump and dart around the battlefield as much as you usually do because we don't have leap on this build. So when it then gets over to the actual build itself, as usual, we'll look at the weapons, the armor, we'll talk about the skills and the rotation, we'll look at the class tree, we'll talk about PAX points, which ones to pick, and I'll give you some pointers as to what you should focus on first in the Ascension tree. Now, what is, as I've mentioned, really important is we want to be trying to get a weapon that allows us to ramp up additional anomaly power, because we are, of course, this is an anomaly focused class, and we are trying to, or rather a anomaly focused build, we are trying to push out as much anomaly damage as possible. So in that case, what I'm using here is a Thunderbird that rolls by default with Ultimate Storm Whip on it. I was lucky enough to get Fortress on the Apocalypse slot, and so what I did is I just slapped on a Mage's Rage here. Now this is essentially my ramp up weapon, and this allows me to, whether I'm have the time to pull off some critical shots on an enemy and ramp up Mage's Rage, or maybe I just quickly want to ramp up against some trash, so I just put some bullets into some enemies and ramp up Fortress. Of course, if I combine both of those, that's the optimum damage dealing variant that you have of this. So on bosses, you'll always want to be hitting those crits and ramping up both weapons, or rather both mods, before you dump all of your abilities on the enemy. Now, as usual with this kind of build where enemies can eventually make it through all of your quakes and your impales and all of that stuff and get close to you, it's a good idea to run something that works off the recycle or the reload meta. In this case, I've got a guillotine here with radiation splash, moaning winds, and clip combustion. That just allows me to push up a huge amount of damage every 8 seconds based on reloading the weapon, and it's a great way for you to finish off chunky enemies that have managed to survive through your combo. Now, The pistol doesn't really matter here, but of course, you know, you could have something on here that could further on debuff enemies, maybe something like Omen, or you could have something like, I mean, we have options here like Firestorm. There's additional things at Violent Rupture. These are all good things that you can add additional damage onto enemies, because like I said, while killing trash with this build isn't really a problem, you do want to be giving yourself every opportunity for increased damage against bosses. Captains and elites are also generally quite fodder to this boss, so it really is only red bar enemies like your second arbiter, for instance. Now, when we get over to the armor itself, and obviously excuse the transmog here, as mentioned, this uses the Seismic Commander set. So we have the Seismic head on here, which has Ultimate Impaler on, which says that you can activate Impale 2 more times before triggering the cooldown. So when we put Ultimate Impaler on here, that gives us access to 3 impales right there. Now we also have Shredder on here. Shredder is one of the new mods that came with Worldslayer, and this says that enemies not killed by the skill are hit with a second spike after a 0.5 second delay, dealing 50% of the damage dealt by the first spike. Now this is just a great follow-up, and oftentimes you'll find that maybe you impale an enemy and he has a little bit of life left, or basically like 10 to 15% of his HP left, then this second impale from the Shredder will finish off and actually spike the enemy up. Now Spike Forest is a tier 1 mod that essentially just says that your impale can strike 1 additional target. So then when we get over to the chest piece, we actually have a Bannerlord piece here, and this has Sacrificial Altar on it. Now you'll notice, and you would have seen it in the footage that ran in the background before, that once enemies that are killed by, so this says enemies killed by the skill create a protective sphere around them. That's why you'll see this yellow sort of sphere around that. While inside that sphere, you receive 20% bonus to either firepower or anomaly, depending on which one of those two are higher. For us with this build, anomaly power is higher, so that'll be higher. And this lasts for 3 seconds after you walk out of the sphere. This bonus is reduced to 10% for your allies, so even though you don't give them the 20% bonus to firepower anomaly, they actually get a 10% bonus, which is kind of cool. And the point is, the sphere that comes from this is relatively large, so what you can usually do is with your first impale, you're going to hit the first couple of guys close to you, and then before you drop your other impales or your other skills, just walk into that little sphere and then actually get benefit from the additional AP that you get from that. Now, Earth's Legacy on here gives our earthquakes 60% additional range. This is important because we also have massive range on the impales, so we need to make sure that our earthquakes can reach as far as possible, and that's how you do it. Secondly, or rather thirdly on here, we have Palisade on here, which says that our impale can strike 2 additional targets. So at this point, our impale can basically hit 4 targets due to the fact that we have impale hitting 1 just by default. Then we have Spike Forest giving it another 1, and now we also add Palisade to it, making it another 2. So we can hit 4 with every 1 impale. And since we have access to 4 impales, that means we can impale 4 times 4 enemies, which is huge. 16 enemies up at once. So then we have the Pants here, which is our second piece of Seismic Commander. This has increased damage dealt to enemies afflicted by bleed by 16%. All of our damage dealing skills inflict bleed, whether it's Earthquake or Impale, so this will just help us deal more damage to them. Now, Rivers of Blood is really good, and it is kind of like niche. You really have to put that onto this build, especially if you fuck with Impale. This says that it increases your skill damage by 30% to enemies afflicted with bleed. That means sometimes it makes more sense to actually hit a bunch of enemies, especially if they're tougher enemies. You hit them with 1 or 2 earthquakes before you impale them, because that's actually going to get the bleed onto them, which means that first impale is going to hit that much harder. Now, I wouldn't call this a dead mod. Sure, it helps with some survivability. Not that this build struggles with survivability, but Vaccinated on here means that we take less damage from burn, toxic, or bleed. But absolutely, once I find an upgrade to this would make more sense to give us another mod for Earthquake, or give us another mod for Impale, or give us, you know, another way to get additional AP or something like that. Then we have Postmortem on our gloves here. This is our second piece of Bannerlord. We have Postmortem on here, which says that enemies killed by the skill generate up to 3 additional spikes, impaling enemies within a 5-meter radius from that killed enemy. That means that even though you can only impale 4 enemies at a time, the point is that once you hit like a cluster of enemies, and there might be 2 or 3 stragglers hanging around, they're still gonna get impaled as well. Now Vlad's grasp on here is really good. This makes it so that you can almost impale enemies from across the screen. So you'll notice as soon as you walk into an arena, you can actually hit very far with the impales, actually further than you can hit with the earthquakes. So you can also lead with impales and then follow up with earthquakes in your rotation. Now ground crush over here just increases the base damage of our earthquake. We have access to 3 earthquakes, so this is going to increase our overall damage once we do a rotation by 1,000,000 basically, which is not bad at all. Lastly, on our pants over here, we have second quake, which gives us our, now that's how we get access to 3 quakes, plus of course earthquake. And then we also have impale on here, which says that the skill can be activated 1 more time before triggering the cooldown. That means all in all, when we go to the skills here, we have access to 3 earthquakes and 4 impales before everything goes on cooldown. That's a huge amount of damage you can push out. And then of course we're using reflect bullets on here because when we go bottom tree in the class tree, when we see just now, that allows us to actually ramp up our AP. Now you'll see earthquake is on a fairly low cooldown of 5.2 seconds, which means every time you use impale, you'll be able to get 2 full cycles of earthquake out. So what you can do, what's a really strong rotation, especially if you are, I mean, if you're just going up against trash, just run through them and just impale everything and move the fuck on. It's as easy as that. But if you're going up against tough enemies, a really strong rotation would be earthquake, 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 impale, 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 and by the time you're done with that 4th impale, your new rotation of earthquakes is ready again. So you can really just chunk out a whole bunch of damage, and this is fantastic. It's almost in a way like dropping artillery from the back. If you have characters that are engaging in front of you, you can essentially just be lobbing all this additional damage over them. As mentioned, reflex bullets is there for us to ramp up. So when we get over to the class tree, we're going to go bottom tree because of course all of our skills benefit from additional anomaly power. We also do want to be picking up any cooldown reduction that we can get our hands on. And my mindset here was picking up additional bleed and additional bleed damage nodes, because in certain cases, the bleed that enemies are experiencing while they're impaled on sometimes leaves them with maybe like a little bit of life left, or maybe, you know, it just takes too long. So the point is this will actually make your bleed ticks tick for more, because we actually have nodes here that do that, like for instance bloodbath here and bloodbath there, and that's actually going to make your bleed overall deal more damage and just benefit you more due to the fact that you're also once again using SEISMIC Commander. Now the difference between this and running like straightforward bleed quake is that with bleed quake, your earthquakes are hitting for such huge amounts due to the other things that you're stacking on there, that sometimes it doesn't really matter that you have additional bleed damage. But I've been toying with this additional bleed nodes here and without them, and I do feel that it kind of like increases the damage profile of this, especially if you play in group play, which is something that I really like doing with this build. So there you have enemies with much larger health pools, and so bleed gets to actually tick and do some damage, and you'll definitely notice that additional bleed damage in your damage report at the end of a run. So just mentioning here, we have 2 points spare once we do this whole run through here, so I get us some additional health and a little bit of armor there, but you can really do anything with these 2 points, whatever you want. But here we're going to pick up anomaly, we're going to get cooldown reduction, we're going to get anomaly, we're going to get paladin, because this is how we use reflex bullets to essentially ramp up our AP. You can essentially just every time before you start your combo, you just reflect bullets on, reflect bullets off, and then you have your 45% additional anomaly for 10 seconds. So then we're going to go more anomaly, we get some resistance piercing. This is important because you don't want enemies to resist your impale, because then you're just going to be standing there trying to press the button and it's not going to go off. So you want the impale to actually go through, and this is very important on bosses and, you know, captains, elites and all of that. So resistance piercing does help here. Anomaly reservoir is more anomaly power. Here we get our first bleed duration increase. We also get a cooldown reduction node here. This is super important because we want to be getting that impale cooldown as low as possible, because that's where a huge amount of our damage comes from. So more impales means more damage. Then we get more anomaly here. We get executioner, so we deal more damage to enemies that are low life. We also get the red rivers again for increased bleed duration. We get some more anomaly power. We get bloodbath as mentioned before. We get ourselves a little bit of skill leech, although survivability with this build is no problem because of the PAX choices, which we will discuss just now, as well as the fact that your impales actually give you health regeneration, so it's keeping you and your allies alive. We do get skilled sentry, which means that as soon as one of our skills goes off cooldown, we get more armor and resistance, again just helping us survive. We get pure anomaly, which is some more resistance piercing, good stuff. We get ourselves bloodbath, the second node that gives us more damage on the bleeds, and we also get earth's heritage, which just makes our impales and our earthquakes deal 50% more damage, which is huge. In our PAX tree, we are gonna go the standard, I would say, way that you play if you're doing anything with AP, bleed, quake, or anything like that. So you want to be getting impact point, which just makes your seismic and kinetic abilities just flat out deal 30% more damage split amongst the enemies that it hits. So that's really good. We get puncture, so this means that we don't have to worry about, you know, getting an additional mod on there to make our earthquakes make enemies bleed. This just makes all of our seismic skills inflict bleed, which is good, and plus we get a little bit of additional damage to stuff that is already bleeding. Earthen Shell is why we don't have to worry about any damage mitigation or anything on this build. Because of the sheer amount of damage that you're going to be pushing out, and because you're impaling stuff and they're bleeding and all of that, any damage that you deal with skills is going to give you shield. It generally means that while you're running through the battlefield, you'll never see your health even start to dip, because your shield's going to be hovering around 70 to 75 to 85% full the entire time, as long as you keep using your skills. And even your melee is a skill, so that's another way for you to get some shield as well. Now, Upheaval and Multi-Strike is a great combo for you to store additional damage away. Upheaval, of course, saying that your seismic skills, when enemies are hit by them, they become upheaved for 2 seconds. And that means in those 2 seconds, 10% of the damage that's dealt to them is stored and then dealt to them once upheaved clears. Then Multi-Strike on here says that 30% of damage dealt by seismic skills is stored and added to your next seismic skill. Now, you have 2 sets of seismic skills. You have Earthquake and you have Impale, and you have 7 in total. So that means it's going to go low, high, low, high, low, high, low. And then in your next rotation, it goes high, low, high, low, high, low. And so the longer the fight goes, the more you'll be able to capitalize on this 30% increase on every second hit, basically. Then for the Ascension tree itself, I don't have access to a huge amount of points, but I would definitely say that if you want increased damage, you should focus on picking up anomaly damage first here, which is just flat damage across the top. We do want to be getting anomaly power for just more anomaly power on our stat page, which means more damage. Resistance piercing is going to be good for us. I did pick up armor piercing here at the bottom as well, because I was experimenting with ramping it up through other ways. But definitely resistance piercing is a good idea. You could take the 10 points from armor piercing here, and you could potentially put it into either skill leech if for some reason you're struggling with survivability. Maybe you don't have all your PAX points yet. Or I would put it into status power, which actually just makes your bleed ticks even more potent. And then of course you definitely want to be putting some points into cooldown reduction. The rest of your cooldowns are really no problem, but Impale's cooldown is super high, so you want to be driving that down as much as possible, and this absolutely helps with that. Then if I would say that the thing is, like, you don't really struggle with trash, but if you find that your damage is really lacking when it comes to dealing with elites, captains, bosses, and that sort of thing, then of course putting some points into damage against elites will also benefit you there. And that's it for the build and almost the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know in the comments down below how you've been experimenting with Impale, what you would suggest for me to swap in and swap out. As I've mentioned, there's really 2 Impale builds that I want to make. This is the first one focusing on Seismic Commander. Next up will be the build that focuses on Bannerlord. And I don't know, maybe down the line there's something spicy that you could do with Marshall as well, but only time will tell. But I hope you guys enjoy the build. Like I said, let me know what else you would like to see for the Devastator, or any class for that matter. I'm really in the groove right now, enjoying making builds for the game and grinding away and just essentially finishing all 4 of my characters, which by my calculations should be done by 2026 if all goes well. But thank you so much for watching. I already said that, but I really do appreciate it, twice even. It's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me.